tied to the train tracks at dawn. A cowboy pulled her off and gave her a name. The rope was hemp, old stuff, and whoever'd tied it hadn't bothered to do it well. They figured the train would finish the job. I came down off the ridge before sunup, the sky still that dead charcoal color it gets in the hour before anything changes, and I heard the rails sing. Not the train itself, not yet, just that low hum the iron puts out when something heavy is coming from a long way off. I'd been riding since the night before, not riding toward anything. Just moving, the way a man does when he's been too many nights alone with a cold fire and not enough whiskey to make the silence comfortable. My horse, a clay-colored gelding I called Dobie, on account of the color, threw his head up. Ears pinned hard. I followed his look and saw her. She was face down in the gravel between the rails, arms pulled back under her and tied at the wrist, ankles lashed to the left rail with 2 winds of rope and a half-hitch that was already cutting into her boot leather. The back of her dress was the color of old mud, hair loose across the back of her neck. Not moving. The rails were singing louder. I didn't think, that's the honest truth of it. I didn't look east for the train, didn't rein Dobie up and take stock of the situation the way a sensible man would. I just put my heels in and we were down that last pitch of the ridge in about 3 jumps, and I was off before Dobie stopped moving, went down on one knee in the gravel beside her, and got to work on the rope. The knots weren't complicated. Somebody had done this in a hurry or done it mean and careless the way people do a thing when they're sure of the outcome. I got her ankles free first. Hands came after. She made a sound when I rolled her over, not a word, not even close, just a low, broken noise in the back of her throat. She was alive. The ground shook. I got her up in my arms. She was light in a way that meant she hadn't eaten in a while, and I carried her off the track fast and up the gravel grade and just kept walking until Dobie and I were well clear. The train came through about 30 seconds after. A freight moving fast, cars rattling and banging. It was gone in maybe a minute, and then there was just the dawn again, and the quiet, and this woman I was holding who still hadn't opened her eyes. I set her down against a cottonwood that leaned out over a dry wash, sat back on my heels and looked at her. She was somewhere around 30, give or take, hard to say, the kind of face that might have been soft once before whatever happened, jaw cut sharp, lips split on the left side, old enough to have crusted over, purple under both eyes. Somebody had done work on her before they put her on those tracks. I had a canteen. I put the back of my hand on her forehead, no fever, not yet, and waited. It took about 10 minutes. When she came back, it wasn't gentle. She came up gasping, arms going out that same broken sound she'd made before but louder, and I had to put both hands on her shoulders and say easy, easy, something I'd said 1,000 times to a frightened horse and meant just as much here before she stopped fighting the air. Her eyes were gray, dark gray like slate after rain. She looked at me, looked at my hands on her shoulders, looked at the canteen. "You're all right," I told her. "Train's gone." She blinked, swallowed. Her eyes went to the tracks and then back to me, and she said in a voice that didn't have a lot left in it, "How long was I?" "I don't know," I said. "You were there when I came down off the ridge." She looked at the sky, judging the time, I suppose. Then she looked at her wrists where the rope had been. Red marks raw, but nothing broken. "You cut me loose," she said. "Untied you, rope wasn't worth cutting." She looked at me again. The gray eyes moved over my face the way a person does when they're trying to figure out what they owe and whether they can pay it. "I need to know your name," she said. "Caleb Rourke." She didn't give me hers, not then. I noticed, but I didn't push. I gave her the canteen. She drank careful, not gulping, the way a person does who knows better than to make a sick stomach worse. She handed it back and sat with her back against the cottonwood and her knees drawn up and her arms crossed over them, and she breathed. I let her. There wasn't anywhere I needed to be. I'd spent the last 11 years going from one place to the next. I want to be straight about that because it matters to the rest of it. I wasn't running, not exactly. I'd had a piece of land once up in the Powder River country, 60 acres, a creek that ran 8 months of the year, a cabin I'd put up myself with timber I'd cut myself. I'd had a wife, a leaner, who died of a fever in the spring of 1871 along with the boy she'd been carrying, who never drew breath. That was the winter I stopped building things. After a leaner, I worked cattle for other men. Rode the drives up from Texas twice, worked winter gather on a spread in Colorado, spent a season and a half on a horse ranch in the Dakotas. I was good at what I did. I knew cattle, I knew horses, I knew weather and water and the kind of ground that'll hold and the kind that won't. Foremen liked having me because I was steady. The men liked having me because I didn't cause trouble. And I went from one job to the next and didn't plant anything and didn't build anything. And when I looked in a mirror, I saw a man who decided, somewhere along the way, that there wasn't any point. I tell you this because I want you to understand what I was when I found her. Not old, 52, but settled in a certain direction. She asked me after a while where I was headed. I told her honestly, a town called Garnet, maybe 2 days south, where a stockman named Prentice had sent word he needed a hand for fall roundup. After that, I didn't know. She said, "Is there a doctor in Garnet?" I said there was a woman who did medicine. Whether the town called her a doctor, I couldn't say. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "I'd like to go with you if you'll let me. I'll walk. I won't be a burden." I looked at her. She met the look straight. "You can ride," I said. "I'll walk." "That's foolish. Dobie's broad-backed, he'll carry two." She didn't argue further. That was the first thing I noticed about her. She didn't argue past the point where arguing was useful. A lot of people don't know where that point is. She did. We rode double the rest of that morning. She sat behind me with her hands resting on her thighs, not holding on to me unless the ground required it, and then she'd take hold of my belt, just the belt, and let go again when the ground leveled. She didn't talk, and I didn't talk, and Dobie walked south into the morning light with his ears forward like a horse who's settled about his job. Around noon, we stopped at a creek and I made a small fire. I had hardtack and a strip of dried venison and coffee beans I could crack and boil rough. She ate what I gave her without comment. When she was done, she said, quietly, "Thank you," and I could tell it wasn't just about the food. I said, "You want to tell me what happened?" She looked at the fire for a time. Then she said, "My name was Martha Elgin. That was as important. There were men who wanted something my husband had: land, a water right, the deed to a parcel that matters because it sits between two others that matter more. My husband is dead, has been for 3 months. The land should have come to me, but they said the papers weren't right and they took it anyway. Then they decided I was a loose end." She said it the way you say something you've rehearsed until the feeling's gone out of it. Because if the feeling stays in it, you can't say it at all. "They put you on those tracks," I said. "2 nights ago. I was on them a long time before you came." She said it plain. I didn't say anything to that. There wasn't anything to say. "I don't have a name anymore," she said, "because the name I had is the name they know, and I don't have a place or papers or money." A pause. "I have exactly what you see." I looked at her across the fire. "Rourke's a good enough name," I said, "if you need one for a while." She looked up. "Martha Rourke," I said. "People will assume whatever they assume. I don't care what they assume, if it gives you cover until you figure out what's next." She was quiet for a long moment. "You don't know me," she said. "I know enough." Garnet was 2 days south and a half-day west, and we made it by the afternoon of the 3rd day. I'd pushed Dobie a little harder than I liked, but the weather was coming. I could smell it, that iron smell that means snow in September up at altitude, and I wanted a roof over her before it arrived. The town was ordinary. A main street with a mercantile, a feed store, a livery, a saloon that doubled as a hotel when travelers came through, a church someone had started and not finished. The woman who did medicine was named Agnes Brecht. She kept a house at the south end of the street with a dried herb bundle above the door, and a painted sign that said BRECHT in letters somebody careful had done. I tied Dobie at the rail and we went in. Agnes Brecht was maybe 60, built square, with a face that had made up its mind a long time ago and wasn't interested in revising. She looked at Martha, I have to learn to call her that, and didn't ask any questions of the social kind. She pointed me to the front room and took Martha into the back. I sat in the front room for about an hour. When Agnes came out, she said, "Nothing broken, ribs bruised, not cracked. The cuts on her wrists I cleaned. She needs rest and she needs food and she needs about 3 nights of real sleep, and then she'll be on her way toward fine. If you're her husband, you can tell her yourself." "Not her husband," I said. "I found her." Agnes looked at me with the kind of look a woman like Agnes Brecht saves for special occasions. "Well," she said, "she's lucky you found her and not whoever it was put her in the condition she's in." I asked what I owed her. She told me I paid it. I arranged with the saloon hotel for a room for Martha and a spot in the loft of the livery for myself, and I went and found Prentice's man and told him I'd be a day starting, that I had something to settle first. He wasn't happy, but he said all right. Then I went back to Agnes's and told Martha where her room was, and walked her there, and sat with her for a few minutes while she got settled. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her hands. "You paid Agnes," she said. "It wasn't much. I'll pay you back." "When you can," I said. "It doesn't worry me." She looked up at me with those gray eyes, and for a moment she looked like she was about to say something that cost more than she was ready to spend. Then she didn't say it. She just nodded and looked back at her hands. I told her I'd check in tomorrow. She said good night. I went and slept in the livery next to Dobie. The roundup took 2 weeks. I worked the gather with Prentice's regular hands, 4 of them, and an extra man Prentice had hired out of Casper who was a good roper and a poor conversationalist, which meant we got along. We pushed cattle off the high pastures before the snow settled in for real, and I was in the saddle 12, sometimes 14 hours a day, and I slept the deep sleep of a man who's worked his body past the point of thought. Every few days, when we brought a gather back to the main ranch, I'd ride into town and check on Martha. The second time, she was up and moving. She'd taken a job helping in the mercantile, stocking mostly, and keeping inventory in exchange for meals and a small wage. She'd traded her ruined dress for a plain gray one that fit her well, and her face had filled in a little, and when she smiled at me at the door of the mercantile, there was something in it that hadn't been there before. "How's the work?" I asked. "Good," she said. "Honest." She paused. "His name is Elver, the owner. He's kind. Old and slow but kind. He doesn't ask things." That mattered, I understood, not being asked things. "And the name," I said, "Rourke." "Serving its purpose," she said. "People assume you were right about that." She handed me a twist of hard candy she'd wrapped in paper, said she'd made it herself from something Agnes had shown her. I took it and thanked her and put it in my vest pocket and didn't eat it for 3 days, which is a thing I don't have a good explanation for. The 4th time I came in, she was sitting out front of the mercantile on a crate in the afternoon sun with a mending basket, sewing a tear in what looked like Elver's coat. She looked up when she heard Dobie. She looked at peace. That's the only way I know how to say it. She sat in that afternoon light with her hands at work, and she looked like a woman who had found the bottom of something and was beginning to push back up. The roundup finished on a Tuesday. I got paid. Prentice was honest about wages, I'll give him that, and I rode into Garnet with the intention of saying goodbye. I told myself that on the ride in. Said it out loud, in fact. Said, "Caleb, you'll go in, you'll make sure she's set, and you'll move on. She doesn't need you anymore. She's got the mercantile job, and she's got the Rourke name to shelter behind for a while, and she's got Agnes Breck down the street. You've done what you could do. Move on." Dobie's ears went back and forth like he was considering the argument. I found her in the mercantile. I told her Prentice's roundup was done. She looked at me for a moment. "Where next?" she said. I said I hadn't decided. She put down the bolt of calico she'd been measuring. She said, "There's a letter came for you." I blinked. "For me?" "For Rourke," she said. "I'm apparently Mrs. Rourke, so they gave it to me." A small pause and something in her face moved. "It's from a man in Laramie. He says he's representing the Prentice operation, and there's a permanent foreman's position if Rourke wants it, starting spring." I hadn't applied for any position. "Prentice must have put my name forward," I said. "Yes," she said. "Must have." We stood there with the calico on the counter between us and the light coming in through the mercantile's one good window at a low angle, the way afternoon light does in October. Dust in it. The smell of dried goods and leather, and the particular smell of an old wooden building. She picked up the bolt of calico again, started measuring. "That would be a year-round position," she said, "with housing. Usually for a foreman." "A house?" "Something like that, yes." She measured to a yard mark and her hand stopped. She didn't look up. "I could cook," she said, "and keep the house if you wanted." She paused again. "I'm not asking for anything past that. I mean to be plain." I looked at the side of her face, the set of her jaw, the careful way she'd said it, stripped down to bare meaning, no asking it beyond what she'd stated. "Martha," I said. She looked up. "I'm not looking for a housekeeper." The gray eyes went a little careful. I said, "I pulled you off those tracks because there wasn't anything else to do. That's the truth. But you've been in my head every day since, and I'm not a man who lies to himself about that kind of thing. I'm older than you by 20 years or near enough. My hands are beat up, and I'm not a man who talks easy, and I've been gone from any kind of home for 11 years. I know what I am." She was quiet. "I'm telling you that clearly," I said, "so you don't feel obligated." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "My husband was a good man, decent. We were comfortable together. He died, and I grieved him, and I thought that was the end of that part of my life." She set the calico down flat on the counter and smoothed it with the flat of her hand. "Then somebody tied me to a train track and left me to die. And a man I didn't know came off a ridge before sunup and got his hands dirty on bad rope and carried me up a gravel bank and rode 2 days out of his way and paid a doctor he'd never met and called me by his name so the world wouldn't find me." She looked at me straight. "I don't feel obligated," she said. "I feel clear. I wrote back to the man in Laramie. Said Rourke would take the foreman position. Said he'd have a wife with him if that made a difference to the housing arrangement. The man wrote back and said it didn't make a difference. There was a 2-room house attached to the barn manager's quarters, and they'd be expected by the 1st of March. We had November and December, and most of January in Garnet. I don't have orderly things to tell you about those months. I could tell you we talked more in those weeks than I'd talked in the previous several years combined, which is true. I could tell you that she laughed, not often, but when she did it was a real laugh, sudden and a little surprised, like she'd forgotten she could. I could tell you about the evening she stitched a tear in the shoulder of my coat, and I sat across the table from Agnes Brecht's front room, where she was staying, and watched her hands work and didn't say anything, and she looked up and caught me watching and didn't look away. I could tell you about the night the temperature dropped hard and I stayed later than I meant to, and the fire got low, and she made coffee and we sat close to the stove, and she told me about growing up in Ohio, a farm outside of Columbus, her father who raised draft horses, her mother who died young. She talked about her husband, Eli Elgin, a land surveyor, and the years they'd had, which were quiet and good, and about the men who'd taken the land and the deed and finally decided she was easier dead than dealt with. She talked about it plainly. She decided to carry it plainly, and she did. In December, I got into a disagreement with a man at the saloon. His name was Cord Tully, and he was passing through on his way, he said, to Colorado, but he seemed in no hurry to get there. He had the look of a man who made a living finding angles. He said something to the barkeep about the Rourke woman at the mercantile. I was 2 stools down and wasn't meant to hear it. Or maybe I was. Something about a woman without clear papers, and where exactly she'd come from, and how a town like Garnet was maybe too loose with who it called one of its own. I put my coffee cup down on the bar careful, not slamming it, just setting it down. Then I turned and I said to Cord Tully, looking at him level, "That woman is my wife. She was born in Ohio, and she came west with me, and she keeps her business and doesn't trouble anyone, and she's under my protection. I'd be grateful if you kept your notions to yourself." Tully looked at me. "I'm not a big man, but I'm not small, and I've been working cattle and horses for 30 years, and there is a look a man has when he's decided he'll go the distance if it comes to that, and is not afraid of what that looks like." Tully took a drink of his whiskey and nodded and found something interesting to look at behind the bar. I finished my coffee and went back to the livery. I told Martha about it the next day, not to scare her, because she had a right to know what was being said and by whom. She listened. She said, "Thank you for handling it the way you did." I said it wasn't anything. She said, "Caleb, it wasn't nothing." That was the first time she'd used my given name. I noticed. We were married in January by the unfinished church's half-a-preacher, a young man named Stokes who'd come from somewhere east with big intentions and had been slowly worn down to something more workable and honest by a year in Garnet. He did the ceremony in Agnes Brecht's front room because the church had no roof on the east end yet. Agnes stood up for us. Elver from the mercantile came and stood in the doorway. Martha wore the gray dress. She had Agnes's dried flowers in her hand, sage and late-season yarrow, yellow going to brown. She held them the way she held things, easy, like she'd decided they were hers to carry. Stokes read the words. When he got to the part where he said, "Do you take this man?" she looked at me. Those gray eyes direct. Not performing anything, just looking at me, the way she did when she meant a thing. "I do," she said. Her voice was steady. She decided before she got there, and she said it like the decision was already made, which it was. My voice was less steady, I noticed that. She noticed it too, and the corner of her mouth moved. After we stood outside in the January cold for a minute, just the two of us, Stokes and Agnes still inside. The sky was clear and hard blue, and there was snow on the ground from 3 days before, crusted now, sparkling in the flat winter light. She took my arm and leaned into my side, and I felt her exhale, long and slow, like a person setting down something they'd been carrying a long way. I put my hand over hers on my arm, left it there. She tipped her head in toward my shoulder, just a bit. We stood there in the cold for a while, not saying anything. I don't remember who moved first to go back inside. I just remember the sound of the crust on the snow when we walked back, and the cold air, and her hand tucked in my arm. We left for Laramie in late February, before the 1st of March, because I'd learned over the years that being early to a thing costs you less than being late. The road was cold. We had a wagon I'd bought second-hand from Elver, with Dobie in the traces and a brown mare I'd picked up in trade from a man at the livery, even-tempered, good feet, name of Creek. Martha rode up on the wagon seat with me, bundled in a coat Agnes had given her, a heavy wool thing the color of slate, and she drove for stretches when I wanted to walk or check the wheels. She was a decent hand with the reins, her father and the draft horses, I supposed. We talked some, went quiet some. The plains in late February have a particular kind of beauty that isn't pretty. It's too cold and too flat and too bare for pretty, but it has a kind of authority to it, like a thing that knows what it is. She looked out at it without complaint. She wasn't a woman who complained about landscape. On the second night out, I built the fire, and she made biscuits from a pan of dough she'd kept wrapped in canvas. And we sat close to the fire and ate the biscuits with dried apple and coffee, and the horses made their sounds in the darkness behind us. She was looking at the fire. She said without looking up, "Do you think you'll be happy, foreman work, settled in one place?" I thought about it. "I think I forgot how to want that," I said. "For a long time, but I think it's coming back." She looked up. "I think you'd have made a good rancher," she said. "Your own land, given time." "I had land once." "I know." "This is different from that," I said. "Different kind of life. I don't mean better or worse, just different." She nodded. Then she said, "What was her name?" "Elinors." She nodded again. I said she would have liked you. She had good judgment about people. Martha looked at the fire for a moment. "I'm glad you told me that," she said. We sat there a while longer. Then she said, "I keep thinking about the man who must have looked at a woman and decided she was easier killed than dealt with." She shook her head slow. "I keep waiting to feel afraid again, and mostly I don't. Mostly I feel," she paused, looking for it, "angry, like I wasted years being careful of the wrong things." "That's probably healthy," I said. "Probably," a pause. "You don't seem like a man who's been afraid much." "I've been afraid," I said. I just got to a point where I couldn't afford to keep being afraid of the wrong things either. She looked at me. "When was that?" "About September," I said. She understood what I meant. The corner of her mouth moved. The prentice operation outside Laramie was larger than I'd expected. Something like 1,200 head, 2 water sources, a good set of buildings, main house, bunkhouse, cattle barn, equipment shed. The foreman's house sat about 100 yards east of the main barn, 2 rooms and a lean-to kitchen, with a wood stove and 3 windows and a plank floor someone had sanded smooth. It wasn't the cabin in the Powder River country, but it was a house. Martha walked through it first. I stood in the doorway and watched her go through the 2 rooms, putting her hand on the wall in one place, looking out a window. She came back to the front room and looked at me standing in the doorway. "It's good," she said. We spent the rest of that first day making it livable. She unpacked what we had, which wasn't much, but she'd chosen carefully what to bring, the way a person does who knows the difference between what you need and what you carry out of habit. I split wood and stacked it on the lean-to porch, fixed a hinge on the wood stove that was working loose. She found where the drafts came in and stuffed them with rags saved from Garnet. By evening it was warm. She made supper from what she'd packed, dried beans she'd soaked that morning, some side meat, cornbread in the cast iron. We ate at a table I'd pulled from against the wall. After supper she washed the plates, and I dried them and stacked them. Plain work, the kind of work that's not worth saying because everyone does it. But I remember the weight of those plates, the particular smell of the soap she'd brought, the way the lamplight worked on the walls. I remember thinking this is what a house feels like from the inside and finding that I'd forgotten that. I'd forgotten that. The prentice work was hard in the right ways. The hands were decent, 4 men who knew cattle and didn't require babysitting, and 2 younger men who needed managing but weren't bad at it. Prentice himself came out from Laramie twice a month and left the operation to me between visits, which was how I liked it. He was a quiet man who paid on time, which is about all I asked of an employer. Martha got the house in order over the first 2 weeks. Then she went to work. She found there was no one keeping track of feed inventory and started doing it herself, with a ledger she asked Prentice for. Found that the equipment shed had tools that were rusting for lack of attention, and she organized them and got me to show her which ones needed oil. She put in a kitchen garden in April. Nothing complicated, onions, beans, 1 row of squash in a patch of ground south of the Linta that got morning sun. The hands were curious about her, politely. She was the boss's wife and they were careful, which was right. But she had a way of being around people without demanding anything, and after a few weeks they were comfortable. She brought coffee out to the barn on cold mornings. She didn't chatter or try to charm anyone. She just was present, and it turned out that was enough. One of the younger hands, a boy named Dell, maybe 19, from somewhere in Kansas, no family that he mentioned, came down sick with a stomach ailment in April. Martha went to the bunkhouse and took care of it. She didn't ask permission and she didn't make a production of it. She just went and did what needed doing, and Dell was back on his feet in 4 days instead of the week it might have taken otherwise. Dell after that would have walked into a river for her if she'd asked. That was her way. She didn't work for loyalty and she didn't think about it. It just came. I watched all of this and I want to be careful about how I say what I felt, because I've seen men get sentimental about women and turn them into something that isn't real. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that I watched her do all of this, the ledger and the tools and the garden and Dell's sick room, and I recognized something. Like recognizing a kind of country you've read about and then finally ridden into. Something you knew existed but had maybe given up on finding. She was a real person doing real work and making real choices. And she was doing it here. With me. That's not nothing. 52 years old and going on 53, and I want to tell you that when she brought me coffee in the barn on a cold morning and put it in my hands and looked up at me in the particular way she had, not soft, not performing anything, just present and direct, and like I was the thing she'd decided to be near. It was not nothing. I want to be clear about that. It was not nothing. In June, a man came. He came on a Thursday afternoon while I was out on the east pasture, checking a stretch of fence that the weight of winter had pushed over in 2 places. Martha was at the house. His name, I found out later, was Asag Greer. He was a man who'd done work for the people who took Martha's land. Not a main man, a side man, the kind who does the jobs the main men don't want their names on. He'd apparently been looking for a woman named Martha Elgin for several months, following word from Garnet about a woman going by Rourke. Dell came and got me, said there was a man at the house asking questions and he'd seemed wrong from the start. I rode back. Greer was standing in the yard outside the foreman's house. He was maybe 40, lean, with the kind of stillness that some men have that isn't peace. Martha was standing in the doorway of the house with her arms crossed. She'd seen Dell go and she knew. I came off Dobie. Greer looked at me and said, I'm looking for a woman named Martha Elgin. Word is she might be going by another name. I'm not here to cause trouble. I just need to verify she's all right and give her some information that's come up about the estate. He said it smooth. I said my wife's name is Martha Rourke. She was born in Ohio. That's so. That's so. He looked past me at her in the doorway. She met his look and didn't move. He looked back at me, did his calculation. I want to say I'm not a man who looks for trouble. I never have been. I've hit men in my life when it came to that, and I don't enjoy it, and I was 52 years old and not looking to change my record on that score. But there's a thing a man carries when someone is threatening what he's built and what he's responsible for. A thing that goes down past the level where you think about it, and Greer was looking at me, and I think he read what was there. He did his calculation again, looked at Dell behind me and the other hand who'd come around the corner of the barn. Well, Greer said, I may have the wrong woman. You may have, I said. He looked at me one more time, then he got on his horse and he rode out. I watched him until he was off the property. Dell and the hand watched with me, then they went back to work. I turned around. Martha was still in the doorway. She hadn't moved. I walked over. She looked at me for a long moment, those gray eyes steady, reading my face. Then she stepped forward and put her hands on my chest and leaned her forehead against my chin, and I put my arms around her, and she just stood there like that for a while, breathing. She didn't say thank you. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. I held her there in the yard in the June afternoon light, the horses making sounds in the barn, the smell of the kitchen garden coming up in the warm air, and I felt the weight of her against me and the steadiness of my own hands on her back, and I thought, this is the thing. This is the thing I forgot was possible. Later she made supper. I sat at the table and watched her work. She said without turning, he won't come back. No, I said, I don't think so. But if someone else does. We'll handle it, I said. Same as today. She turned and looked at me. Same as today, she said, like she was putting it somewhere she could keep it. Then she turned back to the stove. Prentice gave me a percentage of the fall sale in addition to the wage. Said I'd done better than he'd expected, which coming from Prentice was the equivalent of high praise from anyone else. I shook his hand, and he shook mine, and he said he hoped we'd come to an understanding about the next year. I said I thought we would. I told Martha that night. She was sitting at the table with the feed ledger, running figures by lamplight. She pushed her pencil behind her ear. She did that when she was thinking and looked at me. We could save, she said. A percentage like that over a few years. We could. Land's not cheap here. No. She looked at the ledger, then at me. Your piece up in the Powder River country, she said. Could you find something like that again? I looked at her. Not the same place, she said quickly. I don't mean the same, I mean the 60 acres, the creek, something like it. I sat down across the table from her. You'd want that, I said. I'm asking what you want. I thought about the Powder River land, the cabin I'd put up myself, the creek, Eleanor. I thought about what it had meant, and what it meant now, and whether those two things were the same or different. Yes, I said, I think I would. She nodded, put her pencil back to the ledger. Then we save, she said, simply. Like it was decided. I reached across the table. She put her hand in mine. We sat there a while. She went back to the figures after a while, her hand still in mine, and the lamp burned down, and outside it was full dark and the cattle were settled and the horses were quiet and the hands were in the bunkhouse and everything was as it should be for the night. I'm telling you this from the other side of it. There's land up in the Powder River country. Not the same 60 acres, those went to somebody else years back. But there are 73 acres 2 miles south of the original place, with a creek that runs 10 months of the year and a stand of cottonwoods along the west edge, and a view of the mountains in the mornings that I've never gotten tired of. I built the cabin myself. Martha helped where she could and directed where she couldn't, and I've learned over the years that her directions are almost always worth taking. The garden is bigger than Laramie. We have 2 horses, Dobie's gone now, old age, quiet in his stall one October morning, and a milk cow we didn't intend to keep but kept anyway, and a dog that showed up one winter and never left. I'm 61. My hands are worse than they were and my back makes itself known in the mornings, and I sleep better than I've slept in my life. She's a gray-eyed woman who drives her own team and keeps her own ledger and has strong opinions about land management that are, most of the time, correct. She doesn't perform softness and doesn't expect me to perform anything. She came out here on the edge of nothing with nothing and built something that's real. We built it, I should say. There's a morning I think about sometimes. Nothing special about it, as mornings go. Early light, that gray-gold color before the sun's really up. I was out at the corral, some fence that needed attention, a post that had worked loose, and I looked up and she was coming across the yard from the house with 2 cups of coffee, her breath making small clouds in the cold air. She had on the slate-colored coat, the one from Agnes. She walked the way she walks, deliberate and direct, not hurrying and not dawdling. She got to the fence and handed me a cup through the rails. I took it. She leaned her arms on the top rail and looked out at the mountains. We stood like that for a while, drinking the coffee, the light coming up slow over the ridgeline. She said after a time, "Good morning." I said, "Good morning." She looked at me sideways, just the look, like I was a thing she'd decided on. That's the whole of it. That's what I've got.